So hello, thank you, Obehi. So me, I'm Talawa Adodo. I'm currently a visiting professor at the moment in African American Studies at the University of Houston. I got my doctorate in Africology at the University of Temple. All right, not the University of Temple. I mean Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That's in the United States. So that's in terms of my academic background. In terms of my personal background, I'm Jamaican, but I was born in Toronto, Canada. So pretty much a large Jamaican and Caribbean population in general there amongst the African people there. And that's about it. That's about it. We'll probably get more into my personal story as we talk about, some of the work I do because it's very much connected to, my upbringing and other things about
Absolutely,
my life.
absolutely. That is beautiful. In fact, we are going to spend because you are coming. You have a lot of richness around you now. Coming from Jamaica, the land of Marcus Garvey, Bob Marley. There is a lot of things to know about that. But let's spend some time with you. Tell us about your where you grew up. Let us see how you begin to form your identity around yourself.
So I grew up in Toronto, which is the capital city of Ontario, which is a province in Canada. So Canada is just north of the United States, for those who may not know, a former British settler colony. So there's that. In terms of my upbringing, so I grew up in Toronto, sort of the surrounding areas of Toronto. Um, I have, I have a Jamaican family. We're Jamaican. Um, I grew up in Toronto's a very multicultural environment. So what I think is important, at least I can say from my upbringing, you really realize, because it can go a lot of different ways, but for me, it was very obvious who I was in terms of identity. Because the thing is, in Toronto, most African people you talk to in Toronto, there's actually a Jamaican colleague of mine, a friend of mine, he's born in Jamaica. And he always makes the joke. He goes, "You'll find no Black people in Toronto." Because if you ask, at least people my age, so people basically 25 and older and other generations, if you ask them what they are, they're usually not going to say Canadian. You understand what I mean? So they'll say Jamaican. So I think that was extremely important in terms of the research I started to undertake, or what I would later undertake as I got older. I think it was very important for me to not understand or not see myself as a Canadian, right? Because people of my generation, because I think it changes, because I'm a first generation born in Canada or plantationed in Canada. I use the term plantation for when you have African people being, really because of manipulated immigration, being forced to grow up in, white dominant countries like Canada, Australia, etc. So I think what's important is that I understood what Canadian meant and what Jamaican meant. I think that has a lot to do with a lot of things in terms of why I didn't have so much identity confusion. But more importantly, I think learning about, because you mentioned Marcus Garvey earlier, I think learning about people like Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey, a lot of Black nationalist, Pan-Africanist thinkers at an early age made me very clear, at least, that I am, an African person. So when I say Jamaican, I don't say Jamaican in a ethno-nationalist kind of way. I understand, Jamaican as a type of African person. You understand what I mean? So I think that's very important. Now, I know, not all Jamaicans think that way. Thank you to the welfare Queen of England's miseducation system, in Jamaica and other parts of, British colonized parts of the world, right? That colonial confusion. But I think that was very important at a young age, understanding that, I am an African person, because there were a lot of people around me who were very historically aware, and that rubbed off on me. And, here we are today. The rest is history.
And that is a lot in there, but we're going to be peeling it out like an onions, one piece at a time. Actually, one layer at a time. All right. You did make mention of the word identity confusion, and I find it very interesting because identity crisis, identity confusion. Okay, we are there almost in the same place. Because if you look at the larger African demography, the larger African diaspora as it were, that is a term that we don't use quite often, but that is actually the best way to describe where we are today as a people. Of course, not only even only the African diaspora, even right in Africa, this is a disease that we are suffering from. So, because you made mention of fear, that is why I'm referring to this. What does it mean? People talking of identity confusion, what does it mean? Because now, in your early age, anyway, you, of course, later I will still ask you, how come you didn't suffer from this identity confusion? So, help me understand what does it even mean?
You know what? Okay, so the two questions is how did I not suffer from identity confusion? And what do I mean? I'll start with the what do I mean part by identity confusion. When you're talking about African people, how I understand identity confusion is when we want to identify with everything but each other. So, in the United States, for example, you have this movement, the FBA, the Foundational Black American Movement, or the American Descendants of Slaves, all these type of Afrophobic identity formations. And then the Caribbean, you see a strong resistance, well, indoctrinated resistance to, being African, even having, locks like myself. You see, I have freeform locks, the way people in the Caribbean, and you probably know in some parts of the continent, how, men in locks are responded to, right? The reception of that, right? All these types of things are part of us, the colonial indoctrination, the Eurasianization of our minds, right? Where we're resistant to anything African. So what I mean by identity confusion is when we want to distance ourselves as much as possible from being who we are as Black people or as African people. We just want to be very distant from that. So that's the first part of your question. Does that part make sense?
Absolutely. It makes a lot of
Okay.
sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or what I will give, because so on the diaspora perspective, we don't want to associate with being African. So we'll say I'm Black American or I'm Jamaican. And I explain, I understand Jamaican as a type of African. Not a lot of Jamaican people would not agree with that. There's some who would agree, who would understand, who have the common sense to understand it, and others, unfortunately, who do not. So there's that part. But on the flip side, what I observe with African people on the continent is one, not seeing people in the diaspora as African. That's the one thing. And the second thing is also maybe more of, I don't like the word tribe, but maybe more of an ethnic nationalism, like saying, oh, well, I'm Nigerian, you're Ghanaian, we don't have anything in common. Africa's not a monolith, so we can't just do one African culture type thing, that kind of mentality. So anything that really deviates from a Pan-Africanist thinking that, Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X talk about, anything that deviates from that is identity confusion.
Thank you so much for that. That is very important. In fact, that is a foundation for a lot of argument that we can actually take, looking into Pan-Africanism and all that. Anyway, let's come to you. You are a university professor. Tell me a little bit. What is your area of concentration? Expand on that, please.
Well, what I focus on, because I have a few areas of interest, but my favorite, I guess the heart, my passion is languages. So, but more specifically, what I look at is the relationship between African languages on the continent and languages of African people in the diaspora. So, for example, in my dissertation, that I finished my dissertation this past summer, my dissertation translation as a cultural act, I look at Medu Neter, that is the language of the people of Kemet, which unfortunately we know primarily in Eurocentric terms as ancient Egypt. So I look at the Kemetic language from a Jamaican perspective. So basically in that dissertation is the first dissertation to take a text from an African language and translate it into a Caribbean language. You see what I mean? And now the part about my dissertation that's important, even though I'm looking at, the language of Kemet and I'm, doing Jamaican translations of certain things, I'm situating both languages within a larger African context in that dissertation. So basically my research does is to show, building off what I do in my dissertation, my research shows that the way African people in the diaspora talk is an African language. Not a retention, not an African influence, an African language. And I primarily base my argument on the basis of grammar, right? Because the grammar you see in the Jamaican language, for example, is tied to African grammar, like the way we use verbs, for example. What African languages have is not a focus on tense, like we see with Indo-European languages, like your Italian, your French, your Spanish, English, blah, blah, blah. But in African languages, rather, the verbs, the way we use verbs is about aspect. So it's how an action occurs. Like when we say, I'll give you an example. If I say, me attack, right? Me attack. You would say that in Ebonics here in the United States, I'm talking, right? Or let me do a more clear example. We attack, no, right? In Ebonics here in the United States, you would say we're talking, we talking, right? But in English, because you see I was slipping up there, in English, you would have to say we are talking, or if you're referring it to past, we were talking. But because African languages are based on aspect, the nature of an action, we just say we are talk or we talking. And that basically is explaining what was happening in the moment. And I call that momentary aspect. That's my term. I hope that makes sense, because I know I threw a lot of jargon there.
It makes sense. We're going to take advantage of your presence here to expand on most of this issue. It makes sense, and it's also very intriguing the way you are looking at it, no? Because the reason we are calling upon you is because you're an expert in this area, so we are going to be squeezing out every moment that we have here.